Chapter 30. I give Underwood's desk the credit. It was an old-fashioned, sturdy affair, and, fortunately, Jabor had materialized on its far side. The 3 seconds it took him to smash his way straight through it gave me time to move. I had been loitering on the ceiling in a crevice above the light shade. Now, I dropped straight down, transforming into a gargoyle as I did so. I landed directly on my master, grabbed him unceremoniously around the neck, and, since Jabor blocked the window, bounded away in the direction of the door. My response went almost unnoticed. The magicians were otherwise occupied. Swathed in his defensive nexus, Underwood sent a bolt of blue fire crackling towards Lovelace. The bolt hit Lovelace directly in his chest and vanished. The Amulet of Samarkand had absorbed its energy. I broke through the door with the boy under my arm and set off up the stairs. I hadn't reached the top when a colossal explosion ripped through the passage from behind and sent us slamming against a far wall. The impact dazed me. As I lay there, momentarily stunned, a series of deafening crashes could be heard. Jabor's attack had perhaps been overzealous. It sounded as if the entire study floor had given way beneath him. It didn't take me long to put my essence in order and get to my feet, but believe it or not, in those few moments, the benighted boy had gone. I caught sight of him on the landing, heading for the stairs. And going down? I shook my head in disbelief. What had I told him about staying out of trouble? He'd already walked straight into Lovelace's hands and risked both our lives in the process. Now, here he was, in all probability, heading straight towards Jabor. It's all very well running for your little life, but at least do it in the right direction. I flapped my wings and set off in grim pursuit. The second golden rule of escaping is, make no unnecessary sounds. As the boy reached the ground floor, I heard him breaking this in no uncertain terms, with a bellow that echoed up and down the stairwell. "Mrs. Underwood! Mrs. Underwood! Where are you?" His shout sounded even above the crashing noises reverberating through the house. I rolled my eyes to the skies and descended the final flight of stairs, to find the hall already beginning to fill with billowing coils of smoke. A dancing red light flickered from along the passage. The boy was dead ahead of me. I could see him stumbling towards the fire. "Mrs. Underwood!" There was a movement far off in the smoke. A shape hunched in a corner behind a barrier of licking flames. The boy saw it too. He tottered towards it. I speeded up, claws outstretched. "Mrs. Underwood? Are you?" The shape rose, unbent itself. It had the head of a beast. The boy opened his mouth to scream. At that precise moment, I caught up with him and seized him round the middle. He settled for a choking yell. "It's me, you idiot!" I hooked him backwards towards the stairs. "It's coming to kill you! Do you want to die along with your master?" His face went blank. The words shocked him. I don't think that until that moment he had truly comprehended what was happening, despite seeing it all unfold before his eyes. But I was happy to spell it out. It was time he learned the consequences of his actions. Out through a wall of fire strode Jabor. His skin gleamed as if it had been oiled. The dancing flames were reflected on him as he stalked along the hall. We started up the stairs again. My limbs strained at my master's weight. His limbs dragged. He seemed incapable of movement. "Up!" I snarled. "This house is terraced. We'll try the roof." He managed to mumble, "My master." "He's dead," I said. "Swallowed whole, most probably." It was best to be precise. "But Mrs. Underwood?" "Is no doubt with her husband. You can't help her now. And here, believe it or not, the fool began to struggle, flailing about with his puny fists. "No!" he shouted. "It's my fault! I must find her!" He wriggled like an eel, slipping from my grasp. In another moment, he would have hurled himself around the banister and straight into Jabor's welcoming arms. I let out a vivid curse and, grabbing him by an earlobe, pulled him up and onwards. "Stop struggling," I said. "Haven't you made enough useless gestures for one day?" "Mrs. Underwood would not want you to die, too," I hazarded. "Yes, it is your fault, but don't blame yourself. Life's for the living, and oh, whatever!" I ran out of steam. Whether or not it was my words of wisdom, the boy stopped straining against me. I had my arm round his neck and was dragging him up and round each corner, half flying, half walking, fast as I could lift him. We reached the second landing and went on again, up the attic stairs. Directly below, the steps cracked and splintered under Jabor's feet. By the time we reached the top, my master had recovered himself sufficiently to be stumbling along almost unaided, and so, like the hopeless pair in a three-legged race who trail in last to a round of sympathetic applause, we arrived at the attic room still alive, which was something, I suppose. "The window," I said. "We need to get onto the roof." I bundled Nathaniel across to the skylight and punched it open. Cold air rushed in. I flew through the opening and, perching on the roof, extended a hand back down into the room. "Come on," I said. "Out!" But to my astonishment, the infernal boy hesitated. He shuffled off to a corner of the room, bent down, and picked something up. It was his scrying glass. I ask you. Jackal-headed death hard on his heels, and he was dawdling for that? Only then did he amble over to the skylight, his face still wiped clean of expression. One good thing about Jabor: slow. It took him time to negotiate the tricky proposition of the stairs. If it had been for quarrel chasing, he'd have been able to overtake us, lock and bar the skylight, and maybe even fit it with a nice new roller blind before we got there. Yet, so lethargic was my master that I barely had him within grabbing distance when Jabor finally appeared at the top of the stairs, sparks of flame radiating from his body and igniting the fabric of the house around him. He caught sight of the boy, raised a hand, and stepped forward, and banged his head nicely on the low-slung attic door. This gave me the instant I needed. I swung down from the skylight, holding on with my feet like a gibbon, seized the boy under an arm, and swung myself back up and away from the hole. As we fell back against the tiles, a gout of flame erupted from the skylight. The whole building shook. The boy would have lain there all night if I had let him, staring glassy-eyed at the stars. He was in shock, I think. Maybe nobody had seriously tried to kill him before. Conversely, I had reactions born of long practice. In a trice, I was up again, hoisting him with me and rattling off along the sloping roof, gripping tightly with my claws. I made for the nearest chimney and, flinging the boy down behind it, peered back the way we had come. The heat from below was doing its work. Tiles were popping out of position, small flames dancing through the cracks between them. Somewhere, a mass of timber cracked and shifted. At the skylight, a movement. A giant black bird flapping clear of the fire. It alighted on the roof crest and changed form. Jabor glared back and forth. I ducked down behind the chimney and snatched a quick look up ahead. There was no sign of any of Lovelace's other slaves, no gin, no watchful spheres. Perhaps, with the amulet back in his hands, he felt he had no need of them. He was relying on Jabor. The street was terraced. This gave us an avenue of escape, stretching away along a succession of connecting houses. To the left, the roofs were a dark shelf above the lamplit expanse of the street. To the right, they looked over the shadowy mass of the gardens, full of overgrown trees and bushes. Some way off, a particularly large tree had been allowed to grow close to its house. That had potential. But the boy was still sluggish. I couldn't rely on a speedy flight from him. Jabor would nail us with a detonation before we'd gone 5 meters. I risked a quick shufty around the edge of the brickwork. Jabor was approaching, head lowered a little, snuffling on our trail. Not long before he guessed our hiding place and vaporized the chimney. Now was very much the time to think of a brilliant, watertight plan. Failing that, I improvised. Leaving the boy lying, I rose up from behind the chimney in gargoyle form. Jabor saw me. As he fired, I closed my wings for a moment, allowing myself to drop momentarily through the air. The detonation shot above my plummeting head and curved away over the roof to explode harmlessly somewhere in the street beyond. I flapped my wings again and soared closer to Jabor, watching all the while the little sheets of flame licking up around his feet, cracking the tiles and feeding on the hidden timbers that fixed the roof in place. I held up my claws in a submissive gesture. "Can't we discuss this? Your master may want the boy alive." Jabor was never one for small talk. Another near miss almost finished the argument for me. I spiraled around him as fast as I could, keeping him as near as possible in the same spot. Every time he fired, the force of his shot weakened the section of roof over which he stood. Every time this happened, the roof trembled a little more violently. But I was running out of energy. My dodges grew less nimble. The edge of a detonation clipped a wing, and I tumbled to the tiles. Jabor stepped forward. I raised a hand and fired a return shot. It was weak and low, far too low to trouble Jabor. It struck the tiles directly in front of his feet. He didn't so much as flinch. Instead, he let out a triumphant laugh, which was cut short by the whole section of roof collapsing. The master beam that spanned the length of the building split in two. The joints fell away, and timber and plaster and tile upon tile dropped into the inferno of the house, taking Jabor with them. He must have fallen a good long way from there, down 4 burning floors to the cellar below him. Much of the house would have fallen on top of him. Flames crackled through the hole. To me, as I grasped the edge of the chimney and swung myself over to the other side, it sounded rather like a round of applause. The boy was crouching there, dull-eyed, looking out into the dark. "I've given us a few minutes," I said, "but there's no time to waste. Get moving." Whether or not it was the friendly tone of my voice that did it, he struggled to his feet quickly enough. But then he set off, shuffling along the rooftop with all the speed and elegance of a walking corpse. At that pace, it would have taken him a week to get close to the tree. An old man with 2 glass eyes could have caught up with him, let alone an angry genie. I glanced back. As yet, there was no sign of pursuit, only flames roaring up from the hole. Without wasting a moment, I summoned up my remaining strength and slung the boy over my shoulder. Then I ran as fast as I could along the roof. 4 houses further on, we drew abreast of the tree, an evergreen fir. The nearest branches were only 4 meters distant, jumpable. But first, I needed a rest. I dumped the boy onto the tiles and checked behind us again. Nothing. Jabor was having problems. I imagined him thrashing around in the white heat of the cellar, buried under tons of burning debris, struggling to get out. There was a sudden movement among the flames. It was time It was time to go. I didn't give the boy the option of panicking. Grasping him around the waist, I ran down the roof and leaped from the end. The boy made no sound as we arced through the air, picked out in orange by the light of the fire. My wings beat frantically, keeping us aloft just long enough until, with a whipping and stabbing and a cracking of branches, we plunged into the foliage of the evergreen tree. I clasped the trunk, stopped us from falling. The boy steadied himself against a branch. I glanced back at the house. A black silhouette moved slowly against the fire. Gripping the trunk loosely, I let us slide. The bark sheared away against each claw as we descended. We landed in wet grass in the darkness at the foot of the tree. I set the boy on his feet again. "Now, absolute silence," I whispered, "and keep below the trees." Then away we slunk, my master and I, into the dripping darkness of the garden, as the wail of fire engines grew in the street beyond, and another great beam crashed into the flaming ruin of his master's house.